Arthur Lydiard coached and lectured extensively across all areas of athletics: the young and the old, the joggers and the elite, the fun runners and the thousands involved in the marathon boom. But the specialty that made him world famous was developing Olympic and world champions from 800 meters to the marathon. The New Zealand genius was an innovator and a pathfinder, departing from traditional training methods to devise the Lydiard system, which produced athletes with superior stamina through long running and testing hills, and enhanced their speed through surges and mill work. His tapering strategy before races was masterly, and a critical factor in his success. Another crucial factor was his ability to instill confidence in his athletes. The combination allowed them to dream of achieving the impossible. Today, we're reading from Arthur Lydiard, Master Coach, and this one has been truly inspirational for me. Over the past 6 weeks, I've been doing a running schedule that is based on Lydiard's training methods. At first, I absolutely killed myself because that is my tendency, and I even got sick off of it. But now I've tapered off a bit, and I've really enjoyed running again, which is something I couldn't say, for the past 10 years at all. We'll see Arthur's obsessive nature throughout this book, that things have to be done his way. He's a zealot when it comes to running, and he puts in the miles himself to be able to understand over a period of years what is the best training for middle to long distance running. Arthur makes a challenging claim that the main requirement of a half miler, which is a relatively short distance, was endurance. Snell proved it. Peter Snell, we'll learn about him a little later. In December 1961, he ran a marathon in 2 hours and 41 minutes. On January 27th, 1962, he ran a world mile record, and on February 3rd, the world 800 meter and 880-yard world records. In 1964, he ran and won 6 races to take the very rare 800 and 1500 meter Olympic Games double in Tokyo. From a young age, Arthur wanted to be an architect. Arthur Lydiard was an architect, not in the way of his private but aborted ambition to design buildings, but as a creator of superb running machines out of the most basic raw materials. Many of his athletes were masterpieces of planning and design because Lydiard didn't just shape runners, he placed them exactly at the distances for which they were physically, mentally, and psychologically best suited. And he prepared them so their peak performance came at precisely the time required. Now, Lydiard attracted as much doubt and mockery as compliments. Many foolishly attributed his successes to a freakish streak of luck and stumbling across a collection of exceptional athletes. We will see that this is not true at all. In fact, there's a story of Lydiard trying to recruit a man from his work, and he worked at a shoe factory. He also worked as a milkman, but at his shoe factory, he tries to recruit a person who he thinks looks like they could run, and that person actually doesn't. He's not the one recruited, but the one that is recruited is somebody behind him who, upon looking at him, Arthur says, you'll basically die of a heart attack during the first run. So that person's out of shape. And this is the type of person that Arthur is going to have over and over and over again, that he's going to turn into a healthy person in general, but sometimes into a world-class athlete. And Arthur receives this criticism because of the way he trains his athletes. This will be similar to Bill Walsh and his West Coast offense. If we remember from last week, Bill Walsh was criticized as well because he was said to basically be playing backyard football inside of professional football. His little passes or his short passes of maybe 5 yards, 10 yards, maybe 12 yards at the very most, and then runs afterwards was breaking the NFL defenses completely. And he was said to be getting lucky because he had a good team. Same exact thing for Arthur. Arthur's core concept here for running is get stamina first and better results will follow. It's the foundation stone for everything else. And it can be confidently said that almost no middle distance or distance running titles or records are achieved by Western world athletes without the vital ingredient of Lydiard-style training. And the same recipe has invaded many other sports with equal success. That last quote is insane. The amount of influence that we're going to see from an unknown place in New Zealand from one person, one small man, is incredible. So I can't wait to share this with you. We're going to look at Arthur's formative years. He was born in 1917. He grew up in Auckland, New Zealand. He says, "We were a fairly normal family, and we all got along until my father moved out when I was in my middle teens. Apart from one occasion in a city street, I did not see him again." Arthur's mom had 7 sisters. His maternal grandfather, who was a butcher, died of a heart attack when his mother was 15, leaving the family with no income. There was no social security in those days, and Arthur's grandmother earned money to keep her large family by cleaning houses and doing other menial chores. It was a hard life. There was an influenza epidemic in New Zealand after World War I. Arthur was one of the only ones in his family not affected. His aunts were confined to beds in the Lydiard's Reimers Avenue house, except for one who lived in a house behind them. He guesses they were all there because they were short of money and the house had plenty of room for them. Now, I know Arthur says this was a fairly normal childhood, but it's not fairly normal. Already, from the very beginning, when he's born, he's already a leg down because he is born into a very impoverished city. The neat thing about this is every time we read somebody who's born into something like this, they say that it's normal. It was a fine childhood. And I think it's because they spend most of the days outdoor with their friends. I don't know about you, but the street that I live on currently, there are hardly any kids that play outdoors. Besides this one Renaissance family that is doing something about it. They have 3 boys, and I kid you not, they have like 13 kids over there all the time. They're on their bikes. I love it. It reminds me of when I grew up. Maybe that reminds you of when you grew up. I don't know. I'm curious as to how many kids on your street play outside. During this time, there are no televisions. There are no game consoles. There's nothing like that. So people aren't staying inside. They're outside with their friends looking for things to do. Here's some further context into Arthur's environment as well and the lack of resources he had. The married aunt's husband was working, but he never told his wife exactly what he did. This is the person that lived behind the main house. He was an employee on a death truck, as they called it in those days, traveling up and down the street, collecting dead bodies and taking them to Victoria Park, where they had dug huge trenches for the corpses. The death toll all around the world was huge, but all the Lydiard families survived, and that's the influenza epidemic. Like everyone else, we had an outside toilet, Arthur says. If you wanted to go at night, you had to go out in the dark and follow the trail, and your nose, down the backyard. Great on a winter's night. We used to awake to the sound of the cans rattling when the night cart men arrived. Even in 1939, when Arthur married his first wife, Jean, and they moved into a state house in Mount Roskill, the suburbs still relied on a night cart service. We had no electricity, Arthur says, just candles and kerosene lamps for lighting. We cooked on cast iron, coal-fed ranges. Women were marvelous cooks with the big black stoves. They seemed to know just when to open the door. On youthful friendship and growing up, Arthur says we did everything with our mates, tearing around, playing rugby and other games. We had to walk everywhere we went, and we didn't have any money to take girls out anyway, even if we'd had the time. Arthur thought nothing of walking the 2 kilometers to Balmoral to join his football team at Potter's Park. Simplicity was the way of life. None of us had any money, but we made our own fun without it. We played a lot of cards. I remember the excitement when we got our first radio. I was about 19 then. I hadn't even heard a radio until I was about 14. Holidays were a rarity. Now keep this all in context as we discuss his incredible achievements later on in life. We think that people need to be handed a golden spoon. They do not. This is what Arthur's life is going to show us constantly. So remember Arthur's goal of becoming an architect? He says, I was a good scholar at intermediate level. I got 100% in mathematics and science, and I did well in Latin and science. My career goal then was to be an architect. I was good at and relished mechanical and architectural drawing and was working well toward my ambition when my father lost all his money in the Depression and I had to leave school to go to work. I have always regretted that I could not keep on with architecture. He goes on to say, my childhood was virtually untroubled. Family life was good, without any problems until I was about 14. That's when my father buggered off. There was no responsibility on him in those days to look after us after that. But my mother, who was a wonderful woman, managed somehow, and was very helpful to Wally, Arthur's brother, and me. It wasn't just Arthur's father who lost all of his money. Many people at the time did, including doctors, lawyers, teachers, and so on, forced to labor for a pittance to save their families from starvation and their homes from repossession. I still think it's pretty wild that Arthur says he had a pretty normal childhood. Now, I realize he says that up until 14 and his father left in the Depression and all that, but he still thinks of it as normal. Like, it's not rough. It's not tough. This is a person with a completely different mentality than the majority, than more than the majority, than almost everybody. Arthur was involved in athletics at this time, but not to a great degree. He was athletic. He entered his grammar school's race and won. And it wasn't just running he'd win trophies in, but boxing too. Arthur became school boxing champion by fighting 6 successive fights and winning all of them with no training experience. His solution to fighting kids who were trained? Fill the air with leather as soon as the bell went, and so defeat his opponent by sheer aggression and determination. It was another example of his approach to life, his tendency to overcome overwhelming odds by pure resolve. He was a heavy competitor. Arthur pedaled his bicycle between home and work every day, head down and backside up, as if he was facing a personal challenge. He always raced the trams and once took on a racing cyclist and beat him on a hill, unaware that the man he was challenging was the junior Auckland champion. Arthur's main sport growing up was rugby. He played for a local youth team for 6 years before being promoted to the senior side. His size was always lacking. He stood less than 5.5 feet tall, but when he got the ball and dropped his shoulders, he went forward so hard and low to the ground that he was a problem to stop. He once went over the try line with 4 opponents hanging on to him, one of them on his back. Being beaten was not in his nature. Now, being 5.5 feet tall and being in New Zealand and playing rugby, I think that would be like being in America and playing baseball or playing football, 2 of America's greatest sports, and being undersized or being underdeveloped. Because New Zealand rugby, that is the sport in rugby. It's where the All Blacks are. So for him to be under 5.5 feet tall and to be dragging people across the try line, again, sheer determination, sheer will. This guy is unstoppable, and we're going to see it over and over and over again. In early 1939, Arthur married Jean Young. War broke out the same year while Arthur was playing rugby at Victoria Park. The team were given the news at halftime, and it did not occur to anyone that by the end of the war, half of them would be dead. Arthur doesn't go off to war. A few weeks after that announcement, he injures his left shoulder so badly that it limits his ability to lift his arm high and straight for the rest of his life. The Army considers him unsuitable for duty because of this. This also affects his rugby career. He can't play rugby after this. So he starts to enter running races without training, but he doesn't like it because it hurt him to run since he wasn't fit. However, the turning point comes for him shortly after this. Jack Dolan entered Arthur's life and changed it irrevocably. Jack was a number of years older than Arthur, but by no means an old man. His great pleasure was to see others running or at least involved in a healthy recreation, and he inveigled Arthur into joining him on a 5-mile training jog. It nearly killed me, Arthur said. I thought I was fit from football, and Jack showed me how pathetically wrong I was. But his enthusiasm was the most wholehearted I have experienced, and while he was physically exhausting me, he also mentally stimulated me. For the first time, I thought about fitness in its true sense, and that led to the further thought. If this is what I am like at 27, what state of fitness will I be in when I am 47? Maybe you've had this experience as well. I'm sure everybody has. I've had the experience of having teachers in my life where I don't even know if I would like the subject that they were teaching if it wasn't them teaching it. But because they were the ones teaching me, I all of a sudden liked to read. I all of a sudden liked poetry. I all of a sudden liked metaphysics. I all of a sudden could meditate. These things I grabbed onto because of my teacher's enthusiasm. And I believe that that's true about anybody. I believe that if they can show enthusiasm and charisma about what it is that they're interested in, maybe it's in hammering nails. It doesn't even matter. If they can show that level of charisma, it's infective. You will also want to do the thing that they're doing. I think of Bob Ross of those old painting videos, and he's a very quiet man, but he's extremely charismatic. Shows you how easily it is for everybody to paint, even though it's not. So all of a sudden you're like, wow, I can paint those amazing mountain scenes with the sky backgrounds, and you try it and it's not even close to what he does, but it's still fun to do because of his level of enthusiasm. We have the same thing here with Jack Dolan, and thank goodness for Jack Dolan, because if it wasn't for Jack Dolan, maybe we wouldn't have an Arthur Lydiard, and that would be to everybody's detriment. The last line here, if this is what I am like at 27, what state of fitness will I be in when I am 47? This is an invaluable look into the simple yet existential question that leads Arthur to his life's work. We're going to learn how ironic the word work is here in just a bit. The inspiration that triggered Arthur Lydiard seems simple enough, but it was revolutionary then, that the initial step to enjoying running is to achieve proper fitness. Not just the ability to run half a mile once a week without collapsing, but the ability to run great distances with ease at a steady speed. I began running 7 times a week and wading through all the literature in the Lyndale Club library, finally settling on a book by English coach F.A.M. Webster, who impressed me most for his common sense. I now consider he knew more about athletics than anyone else I have read, and his only fault was that he did not train his athletes hard enough. I also broke sharply from the accepted tenets of athletic training about food and drink. I refused to go through the agonies of drying out before a race, and I rejected the tradition of building up on steaks. I used Webster's theory of more regular training and the alternation of fast work with steady work and walking sessions, and I soon found out that, contrary to all established practice, I could drink anything I wanted to. It didn't stop me from running just as fast, and it wasn't necessary to eat rich red meat before a competition. I found later that a cup of tea immediately before starting a marathon was a stimulus, something that Emil Zatopek discovered much later on. Arthur soon decided Webster's schedule was not tough enough for him, since his concern was getting fit for life, not just for racing, and he was starting at an age when athletes were considered to be finished, too old, a belief which he too then accepted. So I stepped my training up to 7 days a week, and I cut out the walking Webster had put in his schedules. I reasoned that, unless the exercise was strenuous, it could not add anything to my condition. I increased my runs up to 12 miles, which in those days was considered a hell of a long way. So a couple things here. I was reading Peter Thiel's 0 to 1 book last night, and I'm at the section where it talks about the power law. Do you know about the power law? The power law says this, and this is basically for investment, so I'll frame it in investment terms. It says that one investment or one company beats all the other companies or investments combined and summed together. Meaning that something like investing in Facebook beats your entire portfolio added together. And I think of this here as well as the power law when he describes F.A.M. Webster. He says, quotes, impressed me most for his common sense, and I now consider he knew more about athletics than anyone else I have read. He talks about his faults as well, but that's basically, I think, saying that out of everything he's read, if you summed up all the knowledge in all the other books, this guy still beats him. That is the power law. Also, Arthur has something in common with Johan Cruyff here. He believes that he needs to put his body through testing in order to become a great coach. Let me say that again, actually, because Arthur isn't thinking about becoming a coach here at all, even though he will become the greatest running coach of all time. Yes, I said the greatest running coach of all time, who we forget about today. Go YouTube Arthur Lydiard and his training methods. There are some people who comment about it, but it is not even close to other more modern day running methods that actually take a lot from him, which is great. That's what we want to do as coaches. But he lives it first. He discovers all of this first, and then he starts training people. And he believes that's the only way to do it. You can't sit from the sidelines and say, oh, this would be a good running schedule for you. I think this would be great. But if you haven't done it for yourself, if you haven't done that, it's impossible to do. And Johan Cruyff would say the same exact thing. He even recruited his assistant coaches. He recruited former players, always, to bring back to Ajax, to bring to Barcelona. He never wanted some administrator coach, ever, who sat there and said, oh, I think this is the best thing to do. No. You haven't lived it. Johan Cruyff lived it. He was considered the greatest European player of the 20th century. Remember that discussion? So him and Johan Cruyff would probably get along very, very well for maybe about an hour, and then maybe they'd argue about little things since they like to battle. During all this time, Arthur isn't competing. He's just running and he's just experimenting with himself. So he begins to compete again. He's chosen to captain Auckland in the national championships. That's how good he is now. Auckland wins, but he doesn't run a good race, blaming his failure on not traveling well. He continues to race and do well over the next few years, but cannot beat the title holders over 1, 2, or 3 miles. Arthur says, these defeats exposed one of my main problems. I was hitting my peaks of performance at all the wrong times. I needed to find a method of not only building stamina for a lot of good racing, but of timing my preparation so that I could be reasonably certain of being at or near my top form in those days when I needed to be. I had to learn to aim for and reach a peak at a predetermined time and then hold it as long as necessary. I was training up to 12 miles every day of the year. So what was wrong? The answer I gave myself led to the marathon type training, which has been the basic ingredient of all my schedules for the past 55 years. I found it by extreme methods. I ran staggering training distances, up to 250 miles a week, and soon found that even if I flogged myself to exhaustion one day, to the point where I either walked or shambled the final miles, I would recover enough to continue easier work in following days, and a week or 10 days later, would become markedly stronger. Arthur ran this amount while working 2 full-time jobs. This is wild. One was at a shoe factory and the other as a milkman. I'd get up at 2 a.m., do the round, get home for a shower and breakfast, cycle to work, and then back home and get to bed about 6 p.m. after another shower and dinner. I always got about 8 hours of sleep. I ran only at the weekends during this time. The cycling and running around with milk bottles in my hand gave me enough exercise during the weekdays. So he's getting his running time while holding milk bottles. I mean, this is like David Goggins stuff here, I think, where extreme isn't even, like, what I think of as extreme isn't even close to what this guy's doing. Not to mention the conditions of his environment that he's living in. Around this time, Arthur starts to gain followers that accompany him on his runs. Laurie King, one of these followers, worked with Arthur. Arthur's first impression was that if he ran a mile, he'd drop dead. But he was wrong. Laurie finished 56th in the Auckland cross country in his first year. In his second year, he was third in the junior section, beaten only by 2 others that joined Arthur's little pioneering school. Laurie entered the 2-mile track meet and beat everyone by 70 yards. This established him in the eyes of interested Aucklands as a coach, a qualification he hadn't sought and didn't particularly want. But he had a growing band of runners who cheerfully tackled the extra training he piled onto them, and he drew satisfaction from the enjoyment and benefit they discovered about long, steady aerobic running. Arthur tries to collaborate with his local cross-country club, but they have a difference in opinion, something he would deal with consistently throughout his life, and starts a running club of his own. He says, without poaching from any other clubs, we built Owairaka's, excuse me for the pronunciation, strength, and in almost 4 years to the day, we won the Auckland Championship. Lydiard in those days was poaching good runners from other clubs to strengthen itself. I began not only with young runners who were not attached to any other club, but who had never run before. So how did Arthur train himself and eventually those he coached? He ran distances of nearly 50 kilometers through the undulating roads and rough tracks in the Waitakere Ranges. These ranges are steep, thickly bush-clad, and the scenic roads and tracks rise and fall abruptly. The midday heat in the bush is intense, Arthur says. But I was determined to find out what the human body would take without cracking, so I frequently ran myself down to an exhausted walk. I always got home, somehow, and my track work improved. I realized I had the basic element of my plan at last. I was training for the marathon, and marathon running enabled me to run faster on the track than I had ever run before. If that was good enough for me, why should it not be good enough for others? I made the discovery neither easily nor entirely accidental. I had begun with a semi-schedule that combined distance with speed work and I just had to keep balancing the two elements against each other. I learned that lack of the necessary conditioning made speed work useless. I could get one good race and then level off. So I altered the schedule and tried again. And as my condition improved, I found myself peaking too soon. I retimed the schedule again to try to slow down the accretion of speed. Essentially, every new point of reference I established involved rearrangement and adjustment of my schedule. This took him 9 years to perfect, where he did little competition with the exception of marathon running. His typical running schedule was as follows: Monday, 10 miles, Tuesday, 15 miles, Wednesday, 12 miles, Thursday, 18 miles, Friday, 10 miles, Saturday, 15 miles, Sunday, 22 to 26 miles. He guesses he ran over 30,000 miles during this period. Now, you would think after reading this, which is after what I read, and I decided, oh man, I have to try running. And I went basically as hard as I could for 45 minutes, something that I haven't done maybe since I was in college, which is a long time ago, which is almost 20 years ago. That's not it. I'm going to tell you right now, if you stop the podcast right now and you go and do this, yeah, maybe you'll feel great after 1, 2, 3 runs, but you will wear your body down in no time, especially if you're not eating or taking the correct nutrients and you just go on to the next thing. You'll get yourself sick. So that's not it. And as Americans, speaking to other Americans on this podcast, that is what we like to do. We like to just go out and do it at the hardest, the toughest thing, and like say, oh, I got a good run in and I feel good about myself. But you have to balance this. So keep listening to this podcast, please. This is only part 1 of the podcast as well. We'll get to part 2. We'll get to schedules. We'll get to another book that goes over schedules. Right now, the best thing that you can do if you feel like you want to run, if you haven't run before, go out for 20 to 25 minutes. Go to where you still feel like you could run, like there's way more gas in the tank. And just do that. Just do that. And make it a consistent thing. Maybe make it every day. Maybe make it every other day. Probably every other day to start. And then build up from there. Because your legs will get stronger. Your legs have to get used to this first. Back to Arthur. On coaching, Arthur says, it's impossible to become any kind of a coach except perhaps a bad one without immersing yourself in practical experience first. Perhaps more than any other coach on our list, Arthur went to the extreme to figure out his training regimen. There weren't many marathoners in those days. Because of that, there wasn't much science as to how marathon competition can best be run. Officials gave it a backhanded treatment and had marathons start midday, which is insane, in the hottest part of the day. Many people were hurt because of heat stroke and hyperthermia. Arthur trained midday because of this to get used to the heat. During this time when he competed a lot, he was running up to 400 kilometers a week, which is around 250 miles. Years later, when Arthur was in Japan, he was asked what main quality he sought in his athletes. His answer was simple: sincerity. Arthur said anyone who coached and helped other people was giving up part of his or her life. I cannot waste my time with fools. Arthur has never asked anyone if he can coach them, but he turns none away if they seek his help. Arthur determined what distance a runner would be best at, not his athletes. His yardstick was the athlete's speed over 200 meters, and having determined that, it was simply a matter of ensuring their endurance was properly developed. His band of acolytes all mainly got together for long weekend runs. They developed a close friendship, despite the competitive rivalry between them. Arthur says, I tried to make them understand not only how to train and what to do, but to understand the physiological and mechanical reasons behind what they were being asked to do. The best psychology I can use with an athlete is to explain exactly why the training is fashioned the way it is and why each day's training is important. My boys could all work out together because their individual racing distances didn't matter. They all needed a high oxygen threshold, good speed development, and an aerobic development to the utmost level. Their training differed only in the coordination periods. Coordination periods here mean where each runner were in their training, meaning they've been training for 2 months versus 2 years. Even where they were between races, that would also change their schedules. Arthur says his system was built for development over years at a time. His greatest initial athletes, Murray Halberg and Barry McGee, were under schedules that would prepare them to become the best runners in the world over years of training. However, within the first year, they were already breaking New Zealand records in practice. I love this example of a coach's belief in his athletes, even when they don't believe in themselves. There's a story. It says, "One test I set them demonstrated this astonishing progress. I told them my schedule required them to run 2 miles in 9 minutes and 52 seconds. They gaped at me in disbelief. In those days, a 9:18 2-miler would be world ranked. Halberg had squeezed under 10 minutes once, but Barry never had. But my system had partly sharpened them, and I told them they should be able to do it. They didn't believe a word of it, but they ran anyways. They clocked 9 minutes 40 seconds, and the following week ran 9 minutes 20 seconds. Then they believed me." Arthur then says the improvement may seem incredible, but they had worked on marathon-type training for 10 weeks, and had then transferred to hill running to add speed to their stamina to a degree they had not known before. They could now run faster than they believed was possible. When they heard their times, we were all dancing around the track in delight. Later that season, Halberg signaled his arrival as an international force by running a 4-minute 4-second mile. This also showed that my schedules were finally right and that all the years of trials and frustrations had not been totally wasted. Arthur is 35 years old in 1958. He's had runners set all sorts of New Zealand records, and he has won national marathon titles himself, even at a quote-unquote older age. Through becoming this new generational coach, you would think someone would recognize Arthur's talent and pay him so he can focus on training Olympic runners, right? The author says, in addition to the demands of a young family, Arthur was still working at a shoe factory, doing his early morning milk run, keeping his home garden in prolific production, building his holiday home at weekends, which he would run about a marathon to get to on Saturday, work on that day and the next, and then run the marathon back home Sunday night, and still finding the reserves to train harder than anyone else. I mean, I'm not sure that I've ever heard about or read about a more disciplined, dedicated, and giving individual than Arthur. He wasn't getting paid for running or coaching, yet it was obviously his passion. And Arthur says in the book that it cost him money to run and train other people. Not only that, but he was already coming up with shoes for his runners to wear. Shoes he made at his factory that would influence Bill Bowerman of Tiger Shoes, what we know today as Nike. More on that later. Okay, now you might think that with Arthur's limited time, with his limited resources, attracting more and more people to him, more and more runners, that he might have to delegate his schedules to other people that he trusts, who would basically micromanage runners' schedules. That's normally how this thing goes, right? Especially in the West, we start to create structure around this new and improved thing. Not for Arthur. Here's a description of Arthur's environment that created some of the best runners in the world. The phone rings incessantly from all over the world, and Arthur barks a few words of direction, clearly, absolutely. No or maybe you should tries. Bang, he hangs up. I have this image of people in Italy and Japan and Portland, or on their cell phones calling as they are lacing up, or a coach who is standing trackside verifying the tempo before his charges assemble. Arthur's house is always filled with young people too. They use his home as a training base and his presence as a direct touchstone. It's totally informal, but it works. This is the author talking here, so this is Garth Gilmore, of what he experiences and what he sees inside of Arthur's home and training base. Arthur is doing all this himself. He's coming up with his schedules. He might be telling another person or another coach in Japan about the athlete, about what to do with the runner, but he's actually coming up with the stuff. He's not saying, you know my methods, you know what to do, just go out and do it. He is constantly the coach. And this reminds me of a documentary here, the whole environment of Arthur's house. I watched this a decade ago or so ago. It's called Momentum Generation. It documents a group of youngsters who become surfing world champions. They also had an open house policy, and many lived with each other. This is also related to the Beat generation of writers in Kerouac and Ginsberg, and even earlier to the Lost generation in the 1920s with Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Pound, and Stein. They all collaborated. They all met with each other. Even though they were competing against each other in some ways, they were around each other. They created the environment where writing was the thing, and it constantly lifted them to heights to read each other's works, right? And this is with the Beat and the Lost Generation in particular. With the surfing generation, they would go out on the beach, they would try new things, they would be inspired by their friend trying something new that had never been invented before, and then they would do it, and then they would add on to that. The key, I think, here is the environment that we live in, that we're around. People's work inspires others to write, to edit, to get better. For surfing, it's the same. To see a buddy ride on a monster wave, to do something they've never done before, riff on it, and evolve it. These are environments that inspire obsession, which takes everyone's craft to a new level. Running with Arthur is the same thing. He's the coach, teacher, guru, mentor, etc. But more than that, he is also working on his own craft, no matter the fact that he's what people think would be past his prime. Barry McGee says, as well as a coach, Arthur became a friend, a confidant, and a father, and I have never lost that relationship. We trusted him. His secret was that he knew exactly how to condition us, how to give us the hill strengthening work, and then combine that with speed work, and slowly get us running faster and faster, and then add the anaerobic work to sharpen us up for race time. This is the secret that half the world has moved away from again, or are trying to do it in different ways. I remember I was once cornered by a coach who said, "Lydiard's going to kill you, Barry, all of you guys." I think he was a hurdles coach. I think I said, let's wait and see. And at the Nationals, we won the 880 yards, the mile, the 3 miles, the 6 miles, and the marathon. We were the best conditioned athletes in the world, and we had about a 5-year head start on the rest of the world. It took from about 1958 to 1965 for anyone else to catch on. What we did was unbelievable. So during this time, Murray Halberg qualifies for the Olympics in 1956 with the 8th best time in the world for 1,500 meters that year. He has a cold during the games and doesn't finish any of his races in medal positions. But if we remember, this is the very beginning of Arthur's training with Murray. I think this is maybe even a year or two in, so it's nowhere close to the finished product. In 1960, Arthur's program is in full swing. 3 of his runners qualify to represent New Zealand in the Olympics in Rome, Italy. Peter Snell wins the 800 in record time. Arthur says Peter was the slowest runner over 200 meters in that competition, but he could maintain his pace from the beginning and even get stronger as it went on. Others drop off. This is because of the distance running he performed with Arthur. Murray Halberg wins the gold medal in the 5,000 meter race and finished 5th in the 10,000 meter. Barry McGee won the bronze medal in the marathon. The author says, the Rome Olympics had catapulted him onto the world stage in spectacular fashion. That's Arthur, of course. Suddenly, everybody wanted to share him and his gifted runners. His training system came under intense international scrutiny, evoking a variety of responses. Some were deeply impressed. Some wrote off the Rome triple medal success as a one-shot stroke of luck. Some discounted the training method, preferring to believe the medals were won by a fortunate combination of superstars. The superstars found this notion and any other criticisms ridiculous, and they were about to dash them into the dust. In January 1961, right after the Olympics, Arthur and his boys go on a European and American tour. Murray Halberg breaks the world record for an indoor 2-mile time by 12 seconds, finishing at 8 minutes 34 seconds. He beats a 2-mile time world record by 12 seconds. That's like breaking a soccer goal scoring record by 3 goals. I mean, that is some distance. Murray was now training at a faster pace than he used to race at, and had covered a trial 3 miles in 13 minutes 31 seconds without the least effort. In March, he won the national title. Peter, in wet and blustery conditions, had run a 3-minute 3-second 3/4 mile, and Barry, the marathon runner, had covered the same distance in 3 minutes and 8 seconds. They were startling times. Those 3 men plus one other ran a 4x1 mile race despite having hardly any experience in miling, and set a world record in Dublin. They were never even a team before, and that happened. Peter Snell even fractured his leg and in the same year won the national title at the 800 towards the end of the year. In July, the team went to Helsinki for the World Games. Arthur says Peter won the A grade for 800 meters, Gary won the B grade, Hallberg won the 5,000 meters, and McGee won the 10,000 meters. Between us, we cleaned them out. On July 7th, Hallberg broke the 2-mile world record in 8 minutes 30 seconds. Arthur has a note in his journal that says Hallberg could do quite a bit better. Wow. He also narrowly misses out on the 3-mile record by 0.8 seconds. Arthur says he could have pushed himself more as he finished fresh as a daisy, quote unquote. On July 25th, Hallberg runs the 3-mile world record in 13 minutes, 10 seconds, and 1 decimal place. Barry McGee was right behind him at 13:11.4. In 1962, Peter Snell breaks 3 world records, including the mile at 3 minutes, 54.4 seconds. Arthur commenting that Peter had never before run a full-out mile. He breaks a world record before ever running the race at his fastest speed. This is not luck. This is hard work. This is training. This is preparation. This is having a great, world-renowned, maybe best coach, running coach in the entire world, like I said before, the world has ever seen. That's what this is. This is taking people from nowhere in New Zealand and doing this. Gilmore says about Peter, Peter was something of an anomaly in the Lydiard stable. Arthur used a basic speed over 200 yards to determine his athlete's best potential, and it always worked, except for Peter. His basic speed wasn't great, and the fact that he became the world's fastest half-miler and miler came from different factors. A combination of the endurance Arthur developed in him and his amazing natural strength. There are other runners that comment throughout this book about Peter in general, and they say he was at a disadvantage because he was a weightlifter at first. And so this put him at a bit more of a crouch when he was running, instead of being a little bit more straight up, which would have supposedly helped him. Now, who knows? This guy broke world record upon world record and was the greatest, if not the second greatest runner that Arthur Lydiard ever trained. Now, this next quote surprised me. Arthur is now training some of the best runners in modern history. His mantra is train, don't strain. And he has always preached training to a point of pleasant tiredness. This is the opposite of the American viewpoint on competition. Then again, Arthur has some pointed comments about the way Americans train, often burning out or injuring athletes because of a focus on short-term success. Being a youth coach myself, I see this all the time, and I see this through parents, and I see this through coaches. We've got to play more soccer. We've got to do all sorts of stuff throughout the year. Kids are completely overscheduled. So what do? They put kids in 162 games a year. Pros, when they play 65 games a year, that's considered burnout. That is way over the injury rate. So we have kids that are playing 162 games a year. And these are competitive games. This is not like street soccer. That would be totally different because kids know how to regulate a bit more at street soccer. Competition, when 60 to 70 parents on the sidelines are screaming at them, when their coach, including myself, is telling them to run more, give better effort, all this stuff. It's not just the physical wear and tear, but it's the mental wear and tear. We wonder why 70% of kids before the age of 15 quit soccer. I think it's probably pretty similar in other sports too. Although in basketball, kids go to a basketball hoop and can train by themselves a lot. Football is definitely more organized as it's a team sport and you're not just going to run touchdowns all day. This was a refreshing quote to me to say, hey, what we don't want to do is we don't want these kids to become over competitive to the point where they always have to win. And then when they don't, or when they stop winning, or when they don't win, they don't like it. They don't enjoy it as much. We'll see that in a quote later from another book of Arthur of what he thinks kids running training should be like. And it's amazing. It reminds me of some almost like fairyland. So this is also related to what Bill Walsh experienced as the prevailing psychological modus operandi that head coaches were giving their teams in the NFL. And now this is with professional players, with grown-ups. Walsh says, the dominant motivational technique in the NFL was to demean players, ridicule them, intimidate them, humiliate them in order to get them emotionally up for a game. Players were often treated as little more than animals to be driven harder and harder. I rejected that approach completely. And Phil Jackson from the Bulls. Most coaches relied on intimidation and fear to motivate players. They shouted, bullied, and tried to dominate their players psychologically. I didn't believe that approach produced clarity or trust. Fear might get a short-term response, but it destroys long-term growth. And Johan Cruyff says something similar. A coach who shouts all the time is a coach who doesn't understand the game. If you have to keep shouting, it means you haven't explained it properly. Football should be played with the brain, not with fear. Back to Arthur. Also, in 1962, Arthur was able to quit both of his jobs as a milkman and foreman. Finally, a cigarette company named Rothmans sponsored him to do what he loved to do. Arthur says, "Far from promoting the very antithesis of healthy lungs, my Rothmans connection meant that I actually stopped people from smoking. I could say what I liked about people not smoking, and I frequently did. Rothmans realized that, through me, they would help the kids, who weren't going to smoke, but if their parents smoked, they'd be likely to turn to Rothmans. In fact, they went from 20% of the market to more than 80% in 1 year when I was going around in their colors saying, 'Don't smoke.' They were clever businessmen. And they were more interested in shifting smokers' allegiances than in encouraging more people to take up smoking." Around this time, Arthur meets Bill Bowerman, then coach of the University of Oregon and eventual co-founder of Nike. Arthur says, "Bowerman wrote to me explaining that he was a good sprint and fields event coach, but he wasn't very good at middle and distance training. He felt inadequate in that area and asked if I could help. I was happy to and sent him my program. He took on all aspects of my training for his sprint team, including 15-mile forest runs, which was a long way for a sprinter, and hill training on a golf course, which was a totally new sprint training approach. I was later shown the hill, which was about 400 meters long. Bowerman trained his sprinters up the hill and on a loop around to the bottom again, and they would do this about 12 times. I had met Bowerman for the first time in Rome. By this time, I had set up a correspondence facility operating with a small portable typewriter, which I carried around the world and replaced only in 2002. Of my early pupils was Pat Cloesy, who was studying at Texas University. He went on to win the USA Indoor 3-Mile Championship. Then Billy Mills got onto my training methods. Billy went on to win the 10,000 meters at the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. Billy said he had tried to run 100 miles a week, the Lydiard minimum, but he could only manage 80, probably because he ran too fast in training. He said he had also developed some illness before he could do his pre-games anaerobic training. This was probably a blessing in disguise because he might well have overdone the anaerobic training, as the Americans tend to do, which would have taken the edge off him and upset the training balance. The Lydiard system spread through America and Europe like wildfire. Many tried to shortcut his system and the results did not show, but those who followed it diligently surprised many people and won many races. Arthur was able to convince Rothmans to sponsor coaches to come to New Zealand so domestic athletes could improve themselves by listening to overseas experts. The first people brought over are Bowerman and his Oregon track team. Gilmore says, "The Oregon team visit had an unexpected side effect, which was to make Arthur Lydiard even more of a household name elsewhere in the world. They arrived in December 1961, just as the Auckland Joggers Club was being established. What interested Arthur when he met Bowerman again was that he was 52 inches around the waist. Arthur discovered this statistic when he accompanied Bowerman to buy a pair of slacks soon after his arrival." Arthur picks up the story from here. "I took him up to Cornwall Park to meet the joggers, and he was persuaded to go for a jog with the club's slow pack. They rapidly disappeared ahead of him, except for Andy Stedman, who kept stopping and waiting for him and encouraging him to keep on. Andy was 74 and had 3 coronary attacks. But Bowerman was no match for him. It gave him the bloody shock of his life, and he was nearly in tears when I got back to the starting point for my run. I asked him what was wrong, and he said, 'I'm an athletics coach, and that old guy's had 3 coronary attacks, and he had to wait for me. From now on, I'm into training.' He was in New Zealand for about a month, and he got stuck into daily jogging so well that at the end of the tournament, he was able to fold over 6 inches of his new trousers. Down in Arrowtown, he ran 20 miles with me. It was a mark of his determination and of the value of a sensible approach that he went from no miles to 20 in 4 weeks. After his trip to New Zealand, Bowerman goes home and starts the jogging movement in America. When Arthur went there in 1963, Bowerman already had several thousand people up and running. Arthur says, "I arrived to give a talk at the Oregon track, and 3,000 people were jogging around waiting to hear me." Gilmore says, While Bowerman was in New Zealand, Arthur also taught him about the design and manufacture of running shoes, and he went back to Oregon and became affiliated with Tiger, a company that was very supportive of Arthur and his runners. Arthur says, some mix-up occurred, however, and Bowerman began making shoes himself and developed the waffle sole, which was picked up by Nike and gained them a big slice of the market. What got them into the shoe business in the first place was a court case over the Tiger mix-up, but it would also be fair to say that Nike's origins are rooted in New Zealand. Gotta love that. I'm sure that Phil Knight would go crazy over that quote. Arthur says about working with Americans, overall, I found working and talking with American coaches a rewarding, if sometimes frustrating experience. Most of them had open minds, wanted to understand different viewpoints, and were keen to learn anything that might help them become better coaches. Their thirst for knowledge was similar to that of the East Germans. They felt they had special problems, such as their college student athletes' long hours of work and study, and the need to reach peak performance 3 times a year for their 3 racing seasons of cross-country, indoor track, and outdoor track. But I have never found a country where similar problems did not exist. And by the way, you can't tell this to Arthur. He was working 2 jobs, plus training people, plus training himself. Back to the quote. The simple answer is the same all over the world, too. Try even harder. And the evidence has been produced by all those nations that did try harder and whose athletes did break through the mental barrier of training over long mileages. Today, distance running for stamina and endurance, and as a basis on which to build other skills, is the core of training regimes for a wide range of sporting activities. The Americans soon learned that well-conditioned athletes could maintain top form for months on end, as long as they balanced their programs of hard racing with training programs which allowed for recovery. The coach's main fault was a failure to explain to athletes why they were required to do certain exercises. An athlete who doesn't understand why he is doing something or being asked to do it is unlikely to work with the required willingness. I have been out with Americans on training runs and seen them take shortcuts back home because they didn't appreciate the physiological and mechanical aims and importance of their workout. Runners in other countries began much the same way, but soon learned that successful training is intelligent training. And intelligent training is knowing not only the what and how of an exercise, but also, perhaps more importantly, the why. Another major trouble in America was a misunderstanding of the value and purpose of anaerobic training, which they used excessively in both volume and intensity, even in high schools. Another was the lack of organized clubs to cater for young runners when they left college. A lot of talent was lost that way because so many promising athletes went back to live in areas where there were no clubs and no likelihood of there being any. The United States had huge depth in middle distance running between 1962 and 1965. They had many milers under 3 minutes and 57 seconds, and a big number under 4 minutes. But the depth lessened after that, and I put it down mostly to excessive anaerobic training, as the coaches drifted back to the old German interval system. I guess the objective was faster, more immediate results than are possible when the training is better balanced. The potential of the modern-day American middle and distance runners is huge, as they have proved before, but it is not being properly tapped. Potential Olympic distance and middle distance champions are everywhere in all countries and would emerge if coaches would concentrate more on aerobic conditioning and not burn their young runners out with excessive anaerobic training to try to gain quick results and point for their institutions. On the subject of young runners, Arthur says, I always remember the words of Gunder Haag's coach, Homar. If you can get a boy in his teens and encourage him to train and not race until he is matured, then you have laid the foundations of an Olympic champion. I believe that sums the whole thing up. Encourage the young athlete. Do not force him or her. Let them play at and with athletics. If you can keep them in that frame of mind and dampen down their early competitiveness and, with it, any discouragement over defeat, their capacity for exercise and the benefits they draw from it will astound you. I have watched thousands of boys and girls running in cross-country packs, jumping creeks and fences, plowing through mud, in fresh air, sunshine and rain, enjoying a sport that recognizes none of the confines of the measure field. I have yet to see one of them fall in an exhausted heap. but all of them are conditioning themselves for more serious running later. One of the advantages of cross-country running is that parents cannot follow alongside and urge their children to faster speeds and greater effort than they are physically or mentally prepared for. The parental influence on sport can be a wonderful contribution, but it can also be a real danger, even a destroyer. Too many parents are more interested in seeing their children beat every other kid than in encouraging them simply to enjoy themselves. They force the child to show superiority, but it is at the child's expense, not at the expense of those he or she beats. In New Zealand, running starts from around the age of 7. Kids under 15 can handle a great deal of aerobic training because their capacity to use oxygen in relation to their body weight is greater than an adult's. However, they usually have highly sensitive nervous systems and cannot stand much anaerobic training. It is not unusual for boys and girls of 10 to 12 to run weekly mileages of up to 120 and even 160 kilometers and to improve athletically. Arthur also does a lot of cross-sport training at this time too, so it's not just about running. A football coach in California told him he's having a lot of hamstring injuries, so he suggested hill springing exercises and got a ballet teacher in to teach them techniques for ankle flexibility. Arthur says those big guys doing ballet exercises might have looked grotesque, but it worked. The team had no more hamstring pulls or leg muscle troubles. If the muscles around tendons weaken, they fail to support the tendons and tears result. The muscles have to be both flexible and strong. There's also a lack of appreciation of the need to have opposing muscles properly balanced. Building the quads, the front thigh muscles, is dangerous if the hamstrings are not equally conditioned. Actually, the hams should be the stronger. Now, some might ask here, okay, well, what is Arthur's weight training regimen? To answer that, Arthur says, at a seminar in the States, someone asked Mark Allen, the great Ironman triathlete, what weights he was lifting. He said, I don't lift weights. I get on my bike at the bottom of a hill, put it into the highest gear I can manage, and put pressure on myself that way. I get a balanced resistance on my muscles, which weights won't and can't give me. Allen never had muscular trouble, and he was the world's best for a number of years. Gilmore adds, as an interesting corollary, Peter Snell, now an exercise physiologist with the medical school at the University of Texas in Dallas. Now, Peter has actually died. He died in 2019, but when this book was published, he was at the University of Texas in Dallas, made the point in a 2002 interview that his 800 meters world record set in 1962 would have placed him second in the World Championships in Edmonton 40 years later. His opinion, independently in line with Arthur's, when he was asked what distance runners were doing today that is better than 4 decades ago, was nothing at all. With the best university scholarships, the best facilities, and the best exercise physiologists in the world, runners' times were no better. Back to Arthur. Arthur is getting ready for a split here with the New Zealand Coaches Association, whose absolute asinine decision-making forces one of the greatest and influential coaches the world has ever seen to leave the country in search for opportunity. At this point in Arthur's life, he's just beginning his adventures throughout the world, and we'll visit that next time on Tacticians Podcast for part 2. I'll leave links to both books in the description below. Any purchase of these books through the links helps support the podcast. Thanks for listening.